Yes, hello again, and thanks for coming back to Classic Dirt Bike TV. Now, Sprite motorcycles were yet another one of the lesser-known British motorcycle manufacturers of the late 1960s and early 70s. And to tell you the truth, until I actually came across this superb collection of Sprites at the Telford Classic Dirt Bike Show a few years back, I myself was also quite ignorant of their existence and their history. And after I'd spent some time filming and taking some pictures of these examples, it was then that I started to dig a little deeper into their past and try and learn a little bit more about their background, and just to try and find out exactly who or what were Sprite motorcycles. Now, the story goes is that Sprite Motorcycles was the brainchild of the late Frank Hipkin, who in his younger days of the 1960s was also an accomplished trials and scrambles racer. But Frank, in his spare time, also manufactured his own scrambles and trials chassis and raced them on tracks all over the UK. Now, Frank's chassis and all of the other parts that he bolted onto the bikes were beginning to be so successful that he was then being inundated with riders wanting Frank to build more bikes for them. And I think it was around 1964 when Frank Hipkin set up Hipkin and Evans, who were trading as Sprite motorcycles, initially using premises at Cross Street in Smethwick in Birmingham, and later they became Sprite Developments Limited, operating from Hales Owen in Worcester at the turn of the 1970s. But as with all of the other British bike builders of that time, who tended to add their own particular slogans to their machines, Frank had his own catchphrase for his race bikes, being built by riders for riders. But the Sprite Motorcycle Company did build some very high quality trials and scrambles frames, and at the height of their success in the early 1970s, Sprite had 3 factories producing and machining parts that all went to producing components for his machines. Now, most of the factories were based in or around the West Midlands area, and it's also said that at peak production they had a total of around 75 employees, all constructing or machining parts to fit onto these bikes. But the factory unit in Tividale cast all of the engine casings and the wheel hubs, fork suspension parts, and some of the other smaller components like kickstart and gear lever shifters, etc., which were all later then passed on to another unit for final finishing. Although the main factory at Stourbridge Road in Hales Owen built the chassis, the fiberglass fuel tanks, and assembled all of the bike's front forks and wheels. But most of the Sprite bikes that were sold in the UK were in kit form, because that way Sprite could then work around paying purchase tax, because the bikes were basically being sold as a selection of motorcycle parts rather than being sold as a fully assembled motorcycle. But many complete bikes were also exported to countries like the USA and Australia, but in the US, of course, these Sprites were sold under the name American Eagles. So let's just take a closer look at some of these little Sprites that were filmed at the Telford show, beginning with this little beauty here, which is a 1968 Sprite Eagle 405, and this bike here was on show by Paul Hipkin, who of course is the son of the late Frank, the founder of the Sprite company. And this bike here is still being well used and ridden by rider Lee Kelly. Now, it's said that some of the early Sprite bikes were originally just modified cotton frames. That was, of course, up until Frank then designed and built his own Sprite chassis, which could use a variety of different two-stroke power plants. And in fact, Frank Hipkin went on to produce a bigger frame that would take the big Triumph 500cc twin motor, so those bikes could be used in the much larger cc class of classic scrambling. And so this particular 405cc two-stroke engine was originally a trials bike power plant, and it was then converted by the late Frank Hipkin for use in this Scrambles chassis. But again, a lot of the early Sprites did use the British-built Villiers engines to power them, but then Villiers stopped supplying engines to Sprite, which is when Frank Hipkin then went on to build his own engine, which was basically a remanufactured version of the highly successful Husqvarna motor from the late 1960s, which when you take a closer look at it here, you can certainly see that resemblance. And as I said, I'm quite new to learning and catching up on the history of the once great Sprite name, but from what I've learned so far, these Husky engine copies were pretty good at what they did, and they suited the light Hipkin frame absolutely perfectly. But these fiberglass fuel tanks were certainly another one of the products that were made at one of the Hipkin Sprite factory outlets, and I'm certain that these bikes didn't have black wheels either back in the day, which is probably all been added to this bike later to keep up with the current trend of old classic dirt bikes with these hideous black wheel rims. But this featured Sprite bike, as I said, was never meant to be an original example or even a concourse shiny exhibit, because this bike here is still being raced regularly by Lee Kelly. So this alloy tailpipe is probably not from 1968. But having said all that, this is still a lovely old classic, which thankfully is still being used for the purpose that it was intended for. So well done to Lee for keeping the bike out on the track. Now, this next example of one of Frank Hipkin's creations is this lovely 1971 Sprite 405, which looks like it's undergone some kind of restoration recently, but I must say this is a superb example of one of these Hipkin racers. And this one here looks like it was almost built yesterday, because it appears to have all of the correct parts in it for a 1971 405. And as I said, here in the UK, we could buy these bikes as just simply the Sprite 405, but in the USA, these machines would be renamed as the American Eagle 405 Talon, because American Eagle at that time were the official importers of these Sprite motorcycles, and American Eagle would also inscribe their name and logo on these clutch casings to identify them as AE imports. And as in our previous example, you can certainly see that resemblance to the old Husqvarna engine that this motor is loosely based upon. Now, it's not a full carbon copy of the Husqvarna engine using Husky casings and other engine parts, because all of this motor's casings, internals and head and barrel, etc., are all cast and were machined in Frank Hipkin's factory. So although it may look similar to the Husky engine of the 1970s. This is still a Hipkin derived two-stroke engine. Now, it was also fitted with an Amal concentric carburetor and had an alloy airbox as well, which back in the day did have a kind of paper element type filter inside, which does seem a little bit of a strange choice for a dirt bike air filter on a motorcycle engine, because if it ever got wet, you could possibly be in a little bit of trouble. But you have to remember the times, and this was the early 1970s, and paper air type filters were very common on a lot of British-made motorcycles back at that time. But without doubt, these little Sprites were proper old school with their steel frames and their polished alloy front and rear mudguards, and of course those quite nicely sculpted side panels as well. And again, this 1971 model also has a fiberglass fuel tank, which, as I said, was very common for the early 1970s. But as you'd expect for that period, it was a nice pair of proper old school chromed steel wheels and a pair of pretty basic dampers on the rear, which, to be fair, weren't fantastic compared to what we use nowadays. But again, these items reflect the design and the materials of the day. And because there wasn't anything really better, the riders had to work with what they had. Now, up here in the rider's cockpit, the correct bars and all the controls for a 1971 Sprite 405 with that reinforcing crossbar welded on, which was how it was all done back in the time. But it's getting quite rare to actually come across these Sprites nowadays, and you almost never ever see any of them on a racetrack or even at a classic race event. And if you did, it would probably be on some kind of display as part of a vintage dirt bike concourse competition. But having said that, I don't think that these little Sprites were ever intended to be a bike to take part in GP motocross and go up against the best of what the off-road world had to offer at the time. These British-made Sprites were more of a kind of fun bike than a serious championship contender. But what they did offer was a light, well-made little motorcycle chassis that was almost half the price of the best European or Japanese racers. Okay, so this was another quite nice Sprite example from Telford, but as to what year and engine size this bike is, I'm not entirely sure, but it could be yet another 405, because it does look very similar to the previous bikes that we've just looked at. And I'm pretty sure that this is a later model, because it has an alloy tank as opposed to a fiberglass one on the previous two bikes. But again, no modern plastics, just some quite nice old school steel and polished alloy for the fenders and side panels. And one other reason that this could be a later bike is that it has alloy wheels as opposed to those earlier steel rims on the other bikes. But again, another stunning example of one of these very rare Hipkin race bikes. And even that alloy fuel tank has the little chrome panels on it, as did, of course, the early Husky bikes of their time. And as I mentioned previously, these Sprites were sold as a kit bike to avoid Frank Hipkin's company having to pay tax, which other manufacturers, of course, had to pay when they sold fully assembled bikes. Although when the British government then discovered that particular error, they soon closed that loophole so that they could retain their full share of any tax that was due. And it was some time after that that Sprite then began exporting fully assembled machines. Now, in this particular shot here, you can see what I was on about with regards to the motor's air filter, which was just a simple paper concertina type affair that once it got dirty or contaminated, you just threw it away and replaced it with a new one. But you can imagine what would happen if you got this paper element wet, and more than likely it would simply just break up. But in the worst case scenario, of course, fragments could also get sucked into that engine. But as I said, paper filters in motorcycle engines weren't unusual for the late 1960s, or in our case here, the early 1970s. But without question, these Sprite two-stroke engines were certainly well built and reasonably powerful, and they did have just about enough power to be competitive, at least at club racing level. And as I mentioned, this model has a nice alloy tank as opposed to those fiberglass options that we saw before in the previous bikes. And this one's all been painted in this quite nice green colour with the correct logo there on the side. And I expect that this will be the stock colour scheme for this particular Sprite fuel cell, because I do know that the Sprite owners like to have their bikes with all of the correct fixtures and fittings and livery painted onto them, just as they had been when Frank Hipkin was in charge. But again, another quality motorcycle which probably had a lot of love and work done in it recently to present it into this kind of condition. So it's certainly a credit to its owner, that's for sure. Okay, so our next featured Frank Hipkin bike is this 1972 Fastback 250, which was another model in the Sprite range from 1972, although why it's actually called a Fastback, I just haven't a clue, but I'm sure that by now all of you Sprite fans out there will be shouting at their screens with a full explanation as to why. But at least there's one thing I do know, that this bike is currently owned and is still being ridden regularly by Roy Dealey. And once again, this bike certainly looks the real deal, and it has all of the original parts on it, and it doesn't look like it's had any real work done in it since it was brand new. So for a 52-year-old dirt bike that's still being raced regularly, this old girl here is still in fantastic condition. But it was still quite a spectacle to see all of these rare Sprite bikes, and inside this one particular room at the show, I think there must have been more than 6 or maybe even 7 examples on display, which is quite rare in itself to see a collection of Sprites all in one place and at one time. But this Roy Dealey machine still has the cast Sprite logo on that ignition cover, but this motor's also been fitted with a different carburetor from our previous machines. But it's another old school polished alloy fuel tank on our Fastback GT Sprite, and this tank would have more than likely held around 2 gallons of pre-mixed fuel, and that Sprite motor wasn't much of a drinker, so this fuel inside his tank would be more than enough to keep it ticking over, even on the longest of scrambles or enduro races. Now, as we move on to the back of our Sprite, we have what appears to be the original shocks from 1972, but what make or particular model these are, I'm unsure. But every part on this Fastback certainly looks like the stock standard item, and also here at the front of the bike it was Sprite's own factory made forks, which it said were very similar to the Italian made Serianis of their day. But these forks were pretty basic, but they still did a very good job on this light little machine. And so in terms of an original stock Hipkin Sprite, then this is another very rare bike to see, and probably what you would have bought in 1972, albeit it would have been a bit shinier when it was sitting in the dealer's showroom. But if it's a nice, shiny example of a Sprite that you want to take a look at, then how about this stunning 1969 405, which is actually a bike that's been put together by Paul Hipkin using all new old stock parts. And this is a bike that Paul built to honour the memory of his late father, the legendary Frank Hipkin. So in that respect, what you're looking at here is probably as near as you're ever going to get to looking at a proper, authentic Hipkin race bike. And when you look at the lines and the construction of these featherweight little scramblers, you can begin to see why these Sprite racers were so popular, not only here in the UK, but also in the USA as well, where they had a huge following in the early 1970s. But as I said, at that time, these motorcycles were badged and sold as American Eagle 405s. And because these 405 motors were said to be copies of the late 1960s four-speed 399cc Husky engine, rumour has it that you could even fit one or two Husky parts onto this engine, but naturally not all Husky parts would fit this motor, because after all it looked very similar to the Husky engine, but the actual design and the parameters were not an exact clone of the Swedish factory engine. Although if you didn't have that Sprite logo there on the side of the casing, you could probably quite easily mistake it for one of the more famous Husky power plants. And again, as in our previous models, we have some Sprite suspension units here at the front. And just when you take a look at these forks, you can see the resemblance to those Italian-made Serianis. But nevertheless, copies or not, who actually cares? The fact is that Frank Hipkin made and used his own parts to build these bikes, and the parts that he manufactured were certainly at top quality, and you can see that quality shining through in this example here that was built to honour the memory of Paul's late father, Frank Hipkin. So you can imagine that this is a very special bike among this collection of Hipkin races, although whether all of these examples belong to individuals or private collectors, I didn't actually find out on the day. But to be able to have them all in one place at one time is still, without doubt, a treat for the eyes. So there you have it, another classy little Sprite, built, of course, by Paul Hipkin, the son of the late Frank. Right, so just to finish off our quick roundup of these rare British classics, let's take a look at a trials version of one of these Frank Hipkin bikes, and this time it's a 1974 Sprite Hodaka 125. Now, as you're already aware, Frank Hipkin not only built frames for scrambles bikes, but also put together chassis for trials use as well, which normally I think had smaller diameter tubing with a pair of parallel down tubes at the front, whilst the scramblers frames I think had splayed front down tubes, which in the case of a Triumph twin motor for scrambles or trials use also carried the motor's engine oil as well. But this featured bike that we're looking at here belongs to Dennis Price, and as you saw in the caption, it's a 1974 125 with this Hodaka motor, and this particular bike here is reputed to be the only one of its kind in the UK, as this bike was originally owned and raced in Canada. But just in case you're remotely interested, now Hodaka was a joint Japanese and American company that manufactured their own brand of motorcycles from 1964 to about 1978, which they say close to 150,000 bikes were produced between those dates. Now, the worldwide distributor for Hodaka bikes was a company called Pabatco, which roughly translated stood for Pacific Basin Trading Company, who were based in rural Athena in Oregon. But basically, Pabatco engineered the engines and designed the motorcycles, and then Hodaka was responsible for the engine's manufacture and its assembly. So you can see why this very light but reasonably powerful 125 two-stroke engine made its way into one of these British-built Sprite chassis. But I'm certainly no expert on these kind of trials bikes, but even I can see why they've chosen this Hodaka motor to be inside this Sprite chassis, because that light frame and this very small compact engine will just simply complement each other as a trials package. And again, as per the Sprite scramblers, it's Sprite forks here on the front with their own homemade hubs, and of course those period steel chrome plated wheels as well. So you can see how the legendary Frank Hipkin and his Sprite Developments Company have left a lasting impact on the British motorcycle industry, and in his golden days of the 1970s, when he was manufacturing these little bikes, he was selling them in decent numbers, not only here in the UK but also in the USA as well. And after the dreaded British government closed that particular loophole that Sprite was using to export their bikes in kit form rather than fully assembled motorcycles, extra costs were of course then added to the bike's manufacture. And to compound Sprite's agony, American Eagle, the US distributor, also went into receivership, owing Sprite a quite large sum of money, to which Sprite just couldn't absorb, which also led them to cease making motorcycles in 1974. But this nice Sprite framed trials bike was just one of the many frames that the late Frank Hipkin designed and built, although his lightweight scramblers bikes appeared to be the much more popular choice for most owners. And as I said at the beginning of this video, up until I actually came across this fantastic collection of Hipkin racers, I knew absolutely nothing about the man, his history, or what he'd actually achieved. But after a little research and talking to people in the know, I'm certainly now enlightened as to just why the legendary Frank Hipkin and his Sprite Motorcycles company had achieved in such a short space of time. So coming up next here on CDB TV, we'll be showing you all of the bikes and all of the racing action from the 2024 Kendall Classic Revival Scramble. So make sure that you subscribe or retune to my channel to take a look at this fantastic weekend of racing. But for the time being, it's goodbye for now.